Hello, my friends, and welcome to the second to last episode of season 3 and of 2023, which is just mind-boggling to me. Today, we are talking about aligning with your astrology. For those of you who are new here, I love to look at the norms that we have and how do we think outside of the box of the way we do things. Because a lot of the ways we do things is just not very healthy. It's not very natural. It pushes us into not being human. And so it's important to be able to think outside the box. But when you are exhausted, when you have a lot going on, when you're caught up in the hustle and bustle of the season, of life in this society, you have all this mental load, a lot of decision fatigue, and trying to think in a new way without some sort of framework to go off of just can kind of feel a little impossible and overwhelming. And so we tend to stick with what we know and what's familiar, even if it's only sort of working or even if it's not working at all. So astrology is one of the tools that I know that I personally have found helpful to think outside the box. And a number of the people who work with me tend to be a little bit of a woo curious, as it were. So having something like astrology can give you a framework to look at things a little bit differently in your life, to think about things a little bit differently in your life, and consider different possibilities or see other ways of doing things, other opportunities to engage that might work better for you without having to remake the wheel, as it were. So from planning, like we are invited into a lot this time of year, to parenting and those relationships, we are going to dig in to using astrology as another way of conceptualizing how we engage. I've invited Babs Cheung to join me in this conversation. She is an astrologer, an award-winning writer and activist determined to prove that using astrology casually dismantles the patriarchy. In business, she wants entrepreneurs and small business owners to stop freaking the F out every time it's Mercury retrograde, because even Mercury retrograde can be leveraged in personal and business development. As your supporting astrologer, Babs helps you harness main character energy, getting you through plot twist after plot twist seamlessly. Some of what Babs and I are going to talk about are your calendar year versus your fiscal quarter and understanding your own cosmic flow, which may look different than other people's. Often it does. And I will say I am guilty of conflating the two, because this time of year, I want to pull in and not do anything and rest and relax, but I have like no planets in my chart this time of year, whereas other people do and may feel more energized. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to, along those lines, talk about astrology as a planning tool. And we're going to do a little pivot and talk also about astrology as a parenting tool. A lot of times people think about astrology as a matchmaking tool, but it can also be a tool to understand some of the dynamics in your parenting relationship, both with your own children as well as your own parents. And along those lines, also talking about generational patterning in astrology. So we've got a lot of fun stuff to dig into. I'm excited to share Babs with you, and without further ado, let's get started. Hey there, I'm Valerie Friedlander, Certified Life Business Alignment Coach, and this is Unlimited. This podcast bridges the individual and the societal, scientific and spiritual, positive and negative, nerdy and no, there's just a lot of nerdy. Come on board and let's unlock a life that's as badass as you are. Welcome, Babs. I'm so excited to have you on Unlimited.
Thank you, Valerie. It's good to be here.
So let's get started with just a little bit about you. I've already shared your bio, but in your own words, kind of like, how did you get to where you are and what you're doing now?
So I'm an astrologer, and very long story short, I found it when I was about 11 through the Catholic Church. It was a delicious and devious accident. I was a troublemaker in Catholic school. I oftentimes questioned why it was that the Bible only had two roles for women, two prominent roles for women, either a whore or a virgin. And it didn't quite sit with me. So instead of answering the question, they sent me to detention, and detention had a computer that wasn't locked. So because there's no password protection, I was able to look up the next worst thing, which is astrology.
Yep. That is called detention backfiring.
Yes. And then at that point, I became pretty obsessed.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about astrology, because one of the things that, especially this time of year, people are thinking about planning, whether they know better or not. Like, I feel like there's this kind of push-pull right now of like, and maybe it's just because that's a thing for me of like, okay, well, the collective energy is new year, right? Like we plan in the new year and we start thinking about like, okay, let's plan out the year ahead. Especially if you're a business owner, there's a lot of like, okay, now we're in quarter one and, we're thinking in terms of the, quarterly fiscal cycles, whatever, like all of those things. And there's a lot of energy around that. And yet one of the things that I've spoken about frequently is this is not necessarily the best time for you to be doing that. And if you're in the Northern Hemisphere and the environment around you is like, we need to hole up and hibernate, that's not necessarily when you're going to go out and start planting your garden, right? This is when you're like processing and thinking about like, what do I need to take and what do I need to release, and like really doing that deep work. And then once the spring starts, then you start to put the seeds into the ground in the plan that you've put forward and the awareness that you have of what you want to cultivate and all of that. So that's like seasonal cycles. But I was really interested in this like idea of what about your astrological signs? A lot of people that follow me are into the woo, as it were, and are appreciate having that kind of touchstone of like, what is that kind of weather? What is my astrological weather? What is supported for me in my energy? And so when you came in, you were like, I do planning based on your astrology. I was like, well, that's interesting. So with all of that said, tell me more.
Yeah, so I want to say hello to all the woo curious people who follow Valerie on this podcast, Unlimited. I got to say that this came to me in 2020 as I was beginning to plan moves for my own business. And something kind of like became very obvious. It's that the Western birth chart is a circular wheel, and those wheels are split up into 4 quarters naturally, just like the calendar year. And especially as entrepreneurs and business owners, we plan things according to fiscal quarters. Now, when I looked up the term fiscal, because I thought maybe it's just business, maybe it's a financial term, whatever, it's not. It actually means like an arbitrary amount of time that you decide is a quarter. So it's really interesting how the US tax and government calendar works. There's a fiscal year for that and there's a calendar year for that. So when we have these two definitions, fiscal quarters can mean kind of anything that truly resonates with how your year goes. So I think in agriculture, especially, the term fiscal quarters came up the most because they have different planting seasons. They have different profit seasons. They have different, obviously, loss seasons, especially if it's drought related. Anyway, I went into a deep dive about what fiscal quarters means. And so it became very clear that, okay, these are astrological fiscal quarters, and these are bespoke to your birth chart. And so when you're looking at a birth chart, like imagine it as a circle and imagine it actually more as a clock. The 9 o'clock position is the moment that your year begins. And that's known as your rising sign. And so that's kind of a great clue to let you know that if you know your rising sign, you know that your new year begins within that zodiac sign season. So do you remember your rising sign?
Mine is Virgo.
Virgo. So it means that somewhere in Virgo season, your year begins. So during this time, you'll feel like you want to plan the new year, actually, that you feel rejuvenated, that there's a renaissance, that you feel that you've processed everything and you're ready to truly get things in order. And you can really see the bird's eye view of the year ahead. And that's generally the symptoms of doing this type of work, of knowing your astrological fiscal quarters. And actually, you can use an ephemeris, or I can look it up right now and tell you what day your year, your cosmic new year, begins every year. And so can you tell me what degree Virgo you are?
9 degrees.
So this year in 2023, I'm just flipping to an ephemeris. An ephemeris is a chart that has all this data that explains where all the planets are any given day, and sometimes even hour, depending if it's moon specific. So yours being 9 degrees Virgo tells me that the sun crossed over that rising sign at 9 degrees on September 2nd. So every year on September 2nd is the beginning of your new year, and then your New Year's Eve is September 1st. And that is specific to you. Now, if there's another person out there, which I'm sure there are many, that has 9 degrees Virgo as a rising, they also have the same New Year's start. But it's very unlikely that they have your combination of other planets.
Okay, so how does that play into, like, when you're thinking of planning, like, okay, this is when my new year is, but the other combinations impact in what way?
So you want to look at your chart, and you're going to want to see where there are the most planets in specific houses or wedges. The places that have the most planets are going to be areas of focus in this lifetime, but it's also the moments where it's going to be incredibly busy as the transits activate those planets. So people who have stelliums, let's say, just for fun, the 8th house stellium, it means that they have more than 4 planets in the 8th house. It means that during that time that they're getting activated, it's just nonstop. But the rest of the year, it's pretty quiet. This is important because, especially as entrepreneurs and business owners, there's 2 types of stress I've learned that people have, including myself. The first stress is, oh my God, everything is happening at once and I cannot manage the things. What is going on? The second type of stress is, oh my God, nothing is going on. I've tried everything, but nothing is moving. What am I going to do? Well, with this system, it really helps them understand, oh, this is actually my cosmic flow. I have a built-in peacetime between, let's say, Sagittarius season and Capricorn season. And this means that I get to take a vacation, for example. Whereas, like, I know that I have my busiest seasons in the summertime. And I know that as an entrepreneur, I need to make sure that I take the spring, which is also kind of empty, to set up for, available channels to help people and build a business and, be there for clients and things like that. So understanding cosmic flow, which is the goal of Planet by the Planets, which is this service I provide, is really the key to no longer stressing out as much. It really helps to have the information there.
So I'm curious with that, if you notice that the careers that people fall into, or like that they're into, that they're building on, if that also flows, like, for example, you say things are really busy, say in the winter time, do they tend to be like artisans or accountants, people where it would naturally in that industry be busy here? Or the other thought that I have is that maybe it doesn't necessarily look like that because that's very much rooted in our man-made systems and capitalism and like the design of how we've structured things. Though I could see that also falling in because we build things in relationship to that too. So
yes, I mean, that's a phenomenal question. I've never been asked that. So I would say that in my research, because I've done a lot of case studies around this as I transitioned into helping business owners, and especially people who have product-based businesses, like they're not the Taylor Swift in that they are client-facing and they are the brand and they are the business, but they rather have a cool product to sell, and that is its own separate entity. What we do there is we run a separate birth chart for the business. And then that business stands alone, that's separate from the owner. And then in that case, I have noticed that a lot of people who have product-based businesses that are niche and relative to a specific season, it will be that they're the busiest because they sell, let's say, like gardening kits, right? So it would be like the peak season for them is like right before last frost or something like that, which is roughly around March or February. And so that did line up, which I found interesting. But more so, even in case studies, I've noticed that has somewhat been the general trend. But then again, in terms of the man-made system, it's hard for me to tell because I haven't really done many case studies that are older than basically 40 or 50 years.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, it also seems like it might be something to kind of look at when you're thinking about what are the cycles of the systems that we're in, and based on what your cycle is, if you're trying to make a decision about like, where do I focus? Like, I want to create things. Do I want to create things for the spring, or do I want to create things that are going to be a winter thing, or am I going to create things like, where does it make sense to focus?
Yep. And speaking of which, I did want to mention, because you said you have a stellium in Libra. I find that fascinating because it means that you have an early degree. It's like in the first decan of Virgo. So decans they're split amongst 10 degrees each. So it's about 0 degrees to 29 degrees per zodiac. And it goes through the different degrees. So you being in the first or the early part of Virgo season tells me that as a stellium in Libra, you have a pretty stacked, maybe second house. And that tells me that not only did you begin your new year on the 2nd of September, but as soon as Libra season hit, you were so busy. And if you think about it year after year, even last year, the year before, 3 years ago, 5, whatever, how many years ago, even as a child, you'll notice these patterns that, oh, for some reason, I'm always really busy during Libra season, which is basically like back to school, right? It's like the first month of school, more or less. And that's something to just really hone in on and be self-aware about. And that's really all astrology and these other esoteric practices are meant for. It's meant to help you become more self-aware of the world around you in ways that are information driven and helps you make decisions.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you said, so I have Virgo rising and then Libra has 4, but very little after that is Scorpio. There's like one sign in Scorpio, and then one sign in Sag, and then Capricorn, Aquarius are empty. Pisces has 2, Aries has 2, and then it's empty.
Okay, this is good. It tells me that you have a lot of built-in peace times, as I call it, meaning that not that nothing's happening, but rather nothing's directly happening to you. It's the people around you, and you're being asked to support them.
Interesting. Yeah, because it makes sense. Like, I have energy.
Mm-hmm.
Like right now I'm busy, but it feels like it's so much heavier. It's so much more of a push. It, like, if you think about like the idea of hustling, like, not that it was intentional, because I'm very not interested in the hustle, but sometimes if we don't plan well, okay, I'll admit that maybe my planning wasn't the best. Without planning that, like, I'm ending up in this push of things. Like, I've got this cluster of activities at the end of the year when I don't feel a flow there. Whereas earlier during that time period, if I reflect on it, like you were saying, there was a lot of stuff, but it was easier.
Yes.
There was more of a flow to it. There was more of a like, okay, I can do these things.
Yep.
So that's very interesting.
Yes. And it's because if we get to like the nitty gritty of it, the way that the planets work generally, and it depends year to year, of course, but generally there are multiple planetary activations that are happening at one time. So it's kind of like a domino effect. It kicks off with the sun. Sometimes there's like a precursor planet because like Mercury hasn't been retrograde in a while, so it moves a little bit faster than the sun. But as soon as it becomes retrograde, it slows down, it goes behind the sun, and the sun is the leader. But the idea is that all these personal planets that move very quickly, they usually activate all your, let's say if you have a stellium in your example as a Libra, you get a sun activation. And then directly after you get a Mercury activation. And then sometimes you get a Venus activation. And then you get a Mars activation. So that's a whole parade trampling through Libra season, which is where you happen to have people to receive that energy and say, okay, how are we going to fire up Valerie. And from what I understand, just like making a chart in my brain of what you told me, it has a lot to do with income and your values and generally like what's worth your time. And this is like, because you're spread so thin, you need to ask yourself constantly, what's worth my time? Is this important to me? Do I care about this? Is this actually my problem? Because sometimes it's not our problem. We just lend ourselves to that problem because we are conditioned to, or any number of reasons, which is why it's important to truly understand your peace times or your built-in not so busy times. Because when you notice that, oh, like for example, I even do it. I'll be like, oh my God, why is everything happening at once? I thought I was in my peace time. And then I think to myself, wait a minute, Babs, how many of this is actually your problem? Like how many of these things actually relates to you as a person? What's something that your action actually moves the needle? And when I look at it, nothing, because it actually has nothing to do with me.
Yeah. One of the things I talk about is like thinking about what roles you have and what's important and what your capacity is and what that indicates for how you show up in the roles or what you need to support yourself in those spaces. So like, you know, as someone who values collective engagement, to be able to say, you know, I know that I'm going to have more energy in this time period, in this spaces. And then I can say, this is what I can do. I can show up in these ways during these times. I might need to ask for more from my community in these periods, or perhaps the way I show up in those communities is a little bit different, is a little bit more settled versus the frenetic, like I can go and I can do all the things. Maybe it's I have expansive energy and I can do all the things versus these other areas where I can be present and I can hold space and I can show up in a different way, and to be able to honor the different ways we have access to show up based on what our natural flow is. So rather than like, I have to check out because, oh, I have overgiven, I have gone beyond my capacity, I am burning out because I didn't pay attention to what my capacity was and what my flow is. And I love how this gives you an awareness piece to be able to be a little bit in advance, mindful and intentional with how you plan. There's a little bit more space to be able to say, okay, I can plan for this, which is particularly important when you're an entrepreneur and also when you're a parent. If you like you mentioned, like school starting and things like that, it's like, okay, I know I'm going to need extra support because I don't typically have a lot of my own energy available in this period. So
yes,
I love that ability to like think about, like you were saying, the weather. I'm going to need to bring an umbrella because it's going to be raining. And that kind of that forecast in awareness. What are the supports that I need based on what my capacity is, based on what's important to me and how I want to show up to those things.
Yes, absolutely. And I guess in the same analogy, it's like, okay, on this day, the sun is activating my new year. I'm going to look forward to feeling more illuminated, more energetic, more refreshed, and ready to take on this new cosmic year and begin my fiscal quarter. And so to go back to the fiscal quarters, the circle with your birth chart has broken down into 4 quarters because it's a circle. It's going to have 4 quarters. Back to geometry. And the thing is that with at least tropical astrology, which is what I use in the Western system, it's Placidus specifically, the houses are not equal. So in my mind, it makes sense for me to use this way because then that means that your angles, your ascendant, your descendant, your imamcelli, and your midheaven are what start off your quarters, your fiscal quarters. Whereas in whole sign, it gets a little bit murky. So I would prefer to use it in Placidus. So make sure that when you're looking at your chart that it is within Placidus and not with whole signs.
Okay. I know a lot of people who use whole signs. This is why you hire an astrologer.
I'm here to support you.
It's a lot it takes a lot of study and a lot of awareness to be able to like put these things together in a way that really digs into what's supportive. And I think I have enough understanding to be dangerous is kind of what I say when it comes to this. Like I can be like, oh, I know what that is. And like, this is over here, but like to really dig in. And there was one other thing that you said that stood out to me, and it touches on something else that you work with is, you mentioned, all the people around you, and this may be an energized time for them, whereas like this is a time of rest, as it were, for you, or like where there's less capacity, but they have a lot or need a lot, or like whatever's going on, and how those things can come into conflict at times, especially as a parent. And since a lot of people who listen are parents, you do something around parent-child interaction.
Yes, absolutely. So the way that I approach compatibility is not the way that pop astrology or any of the types of astrology that people are introduced to at first. My understanding of compatibility is based on activation. And activation is just a neutral word that means trigger, but trigger is loaded.
Yeah, it's an overused word that tends to relate to trauma. So I've been using that term activated. When you're like emotionally activated, when stress response is activated.
And it could be good activated too, like
excitement.
Excitement, exactly. It's new. It's a neutral term that I think ought to be used more.
Like an energy charge. You have an energetic charge of some form. That is an activation.
Exactly. Thank you. Yes, thank you. So similarly, when two people are in a room together and there's nobody else, what parts of you are brought out naturally and what parts of the other is brought out naturally. And so it's the same with children, especially as a very intimate relationship between child and parent. It's this dynamics that needs to be supported, and it's helpful to look at the astrology. So the reading is called WTFIGO with my kids, and it stands for what the F is going on with my kids. Because I think generally that's what parents are often asking themselves, like, what? I don't understand. There's no manual. And so this is the closest form to a manual that I found. And again, I am not a parent, but I researched and did lots of case studies and did so many interviews to truly understand y'all's challenges and the fact that there's no really support out there.
I've referenced the book, The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate, where he talks about like some of the dynamics around like parenting in the society that we live in, where we are not actually in a supported space and like all kinds of stuff. So there is a lot of stuff there, but I really see a lot of value in like even just being able to spot patterns. And that's one of the things that I like with astrology is there's a patternedness to it that helps connect certain dots. It's just like with anything where you can be like, oh, okay, it's not just me. It's not like I'm weird or something's wrong. It's more like there's a reason. And now I have a tool to be able to show up to it better.
Right. Exactly. And that's kind of the wonderful gift of the cycle, of the circular notion that everything is cyclical to the most part. And when you know the times when you are the busiest and most activated, but you also know your child's times and when she or he or they might be the most activated, you can compare your schedules together and as a family truly understand, okay, this is going to be a hard time for my son. This is going to be an interesting time for my husband. Maybe he might not be, or my spouse, maybe he or she might not be available to me. So then I need to call in extra support. Maybe, understand that I need a babysitter during this time or, do whatever you can. But the most important piece of this reading is truly understanding the repetitive patterns that happen throughout a chart. So this is stumbling into more of a pretty new space in astrology called I don't even know the official name, but I'm going to call it genealogical astrology. So it's taking multiple charts and seeing how different signs align and are passed down throughout the generations. So I know a lot of women who tend to have Scorpio moons, for example, and then their children have Scorpio moons, and then their children have Scorpio moons. And this is an interesting lineage point because a Scorpio moon indicates a turbulent child-mother relationship. So when you think about it in terms of trauma and inherited karma and all these things, it makes sense that that's the cycle. It's really hard to break the cycle if you have not the best relationship with your own mother and then you have children and then you yourself grew up with that turbulence. It only makes sense that you have no kind of other option to model after parenting other than what you were raised with. And so I guess the point I make or the many points I make about this reading is that it's not just a deep dive into your dynamic, because that's important, and the compatibility piece is important, or rather the activation piece is important, but it really deep dives into how you were raised, how that informs parenting that you currently do, whether or not you're trying to remake the memories that you had as a child because you had a great upbringing, or if you're trying to break the cycle and do something new that's uncharted territory for you. And then that informs how your child is, and kind of like, I wouldn't say pitfalls, but for example, I had a client who was very surprised that her son was so angrily charged during soccer games. And it like surprised her that he was so into it, but was aggressive and angry about it, because she thought she taught her son better. Like, compose, don't be screaming at the ref, don't get into a fight with other players, things like that, only for us to look into it and say, oh, well, his Mars is here, and that completely activates your second house of values. So you're basically, saying all these things like, I thought I raised you better. I thought you knew better. I thought like we didn't raise you to be hot-headed, like, all these things. And then you have to understand in this context, his Mars, or what he does, because Mars is the planet of doing things, and anger and emotion and passion and aggression. The way in which he activates and kind of operates in the world, especially with sports, that's going to directly challenge your values. Maybe you approach his behavior that's natural to him as wrong. And if you knew that ahead of time, maybe it's not wrong. Maybe it's just a different value system.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting, because I think that this reading would have been so helpful for myself when I was a teenager to understand my parents.
Yeah.
And vice versa. And then even as an adult, understanding my parents as an adult child.
Yeah.
So it really has a lot of application, not just young children, but all parenting situations.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that kind of, instead of like, I didn't raise you properly, or I did something wrong, or you're doing something wrong, instead of that combative kind of discordant space, to be able to help access this is a different way of showing up, and maybe it's not wrong or bad, taken out of the binary, and go, what does it look like to think about this differently, or to help guide how that energy is used, rather than say, don't have that energy, to say, okay, how can we utilize this energy in a way that is helpful instead of destructive.
Exactly. And supportive.
Exactly.
Yes.
This is one of those things, like, I think anything that helps you think outside of the box and think outside of the binaries that our brain goes into when we're activated in a way that is that feels discordant, that we can think about it differently, to be able to step back and see more options, see more possibilities, have access to different choices, and to be able to maybe even, like, with the planning and the awareness of relationships, to be able to say, okay, I know that these are the dynamics. I tend to get activated around this time. What can I do to create a more constructive activation, or a more supportive activation, versus a more stressed activation? Because, like, I know activation's happening.
Yeah.
What does it look like to shift? Like, excitement and nervousness can look very similar, and they can kind of go together. Like, if we can think about it differently, then we can utilize it differently.
Yes, there's that. And then just for, our listeners, just as like a touch point to bring home and ruminate on, especially if you know your rising sign, or your natal chart, for example, whatever sun sign your child is, there's going to be a house that your chart has rulership of the same thing. So let's say in your case, like, what is your child's sun sign?
I have two. I have one who is a Pisces and one who is a Gemini.
Okay. So you said you're a Virgo rising, and your Pisces is going to be on your 7th house. And I'm doing this in my head, just so you know.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love it.
Which means that the child with the Pisces activates your 7th house of relationships. So you probably get along with that one in a more intimate one-to-one setting.
We have a very close relationship. He tells me everything, maybe more than I really need to know.
And then within that, he activates the 2 planets you mentioned in Pisces.
Okay. Yeah, that's Venus and Mercury for me.
Okay. So it's quite frankly great personal planets to have there. Just means whenever you talk to him, it's actually not draining.
No.
Like you talk to him and it's delightful because of the Venus there. You really feel like you're learning a lot of the softer skills, as people say. And then on top of that, with Mercury there, I think what happens is you two can brainstorm. I don't know if you already do, but if in the future, especially if you're brainstorming as like the topics become more esoteric, for example, he's going to be really good for brainstorming and vice versa. Okay, good.
That's been a thing, like remarkably early. He's like, I wonder why I was born who I am. Like those sorts of, he's always been very esoteric.
Okay, fantastic. Amazing. Because in that case, he'll feel like he can always come to you with his very Piscean, weird, esoteric, spiritual ideas, which unfortunately, at least maybe in the trajectory that we're going, it might one day become a safe haven. But for now, it's not very safe to feel these types of ways.
Yeah, that's a whole thing.
Yeah, like he will always have you as a safe haven in that regard. Now for the Gemini. Okay, so that one activates more of a, how do I put it? It's more about your career. So that one is very career driven or career activated for you, which might actually come about in terms of achievement. Do you have any planets up there?
No. Midheaven is there, but that's it.
Yeah. So the midheaven is the start of the 10th house, and it's generally about career and achievements and accomplishments. And so in that case, usually the way that I see it applying is that this child, their accomplishments like help to promote you in a way. So I don't know if like that's the one where you're part of PTA or that's the one that you're involved within the schooling more so than the other one. But it might be prudent for you to think about becoming networking friends with a lot of the moms in that one's group, because that'll help your career. And then as that one grows older, you two can really talk a lot about career and what that means for you.
Yeah. Interesting.
So that's more of a future thing, just because you don't have any planets there to really bounce anything off. But otherwise, it's pretty peaceful, copacetic, at least in terms of sun sign only.
Yeah. We are pretty chill, but we're not as like communicative.
Yeah.
As the other one at all.
Is he the first?
He's the second.
Second. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So Gemini, it's likely that he helps with networking or just in general being incredibly sociable.
He is extremely sociable. Everybody likes him.
Okay. So yeah, if you throw a birthday for him, make sure you extend the invites to the parents and then like work in your coaching.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just ways in which you know that you're activated. So when you talk to one, it might be like you talk about accomplishments, achievements, goals you want to set, things that you want to do that's out in the public or within the public eye or has to do with other people. Whereas with your first son is more like just you two. It's like a nice you two moment.
Yeah. It's really interesting. And I think having that kind of awareness, I hope that the listeners will take a look. Where do you recommend people check things out? I know you mentioned like, I'm probably mispronounce this, ephemeris?
Oh, an ephemeris is a tool used by astrologers or anyone who wants to know the exact placements that planets currently are or have been or will be. So it's specific to transits.
Okay. So is there a site that you can look at that? Like if you're like super nerdy and want to like...
Yeah. I mean, I use astro.com. When you put in your natal chart, you can actually go to there's like an additional option. And then through that, you can find a personal ephemeris to you in your time zone. Otherwise, I'll use like Cafe Astrology, or pretty much if you Google ephemeris, EPHEMERIS, you'll find something. And they have dates that go far back as like 1900, which is for people who study mundane astrology and want to understand like the overall cycles and events. And then it goes all the way up to like 2400. So it's a large swath.
That is a huge swath. Well, and I think it'd be really interesting. Like I mean, my background's in sociology. So like the patterns of people are fascinating. And I love looking at like the patterns of people and the patterns of individuals and how they do things. I'm very fascinated as you gather more data and you think about these things more to look at that generational thing. I feel like the idea of genealogy or like biology and like when you're likely to be fertile or like what your cycle looks like. And so like when you're likely to get pregnant and if that aligns with like certain facets of these things.
Yeah.
One of the things I will often talk about is like, we can't break chains we can't see. So when you can see some of the patterns again, to have a tool to step outside and think about it differently than what you normally think about it gives you access to creating shifts in your life, which then ripples down generationally and also affects communally. And so like, if we can step outside of these
Yes.
programmed ways of thinking and use tools like this, like you, to be able to think about it in a new way, to be able to ground it. Because sometimes it's too philosophical. It's harder to grasp, okay, I can do something different than when you can ground it in, this is my personal experience. This is what's happening for me personally, whether it's in my business planning, career planning, life planning, whatever, and my relationships. If I can think about those things differently and have something to tether them to that speaks to me personally, it helps it make it more actionable, I feel like.
Yes. Yes. I would say that if you really want to use astrology in a very new, esoteric, out of the box way, think about a time in your life that was really, really, really difficult, and then use an ephemeris. Again, we have a link somewhere in the description. Use the ephemeris to figure out what was happening during that period. And chances are you'll see that, oh, there seems to be a pattern. And when you pick up the pattern, you'll notice, oh, things are cyclical. Planets move about, anywhere from like 3-year cycles to 30-year cycles. Oh, something might be coming up soon. I need to be aware.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great tip. So in that mind, how do people access you so that if they want that kind of support to tether it in this tool, in this astrological tool, how do they reach you?
Yeah. So all of my ways to connect are very boring. You just type in Babs Cheung and it'll populate everything. I have the first 13 links in Google. I rank pretty high. And then the 14th link is my cousin, Brian Cheung. So you can check him out too. It's just babscheung.com. And then everything else on social is babs.cheung or babs-cheung. You'll find me. Very easy. I do have a new discovery quiz because my menu is overwhelming, aka robust. So, go ahead and check that out and you'll get matched to the reading that fits your current situation because everything changes. That is honestly the best way to reach me. If not, you can always DM me on the socials.
Well, I'll have links in the show notes along with the images so you can take a look. I'll put my chart up there. You can take a look and see what we're talking about. So if you wanted to follow along or go back and be like, what is going on? Like, we'll have some visuals on my website, linked in the show notes to look at all of that and also to connect with Babs. I always wrap up an interview with 2 questions. One is, what does it mean to you to be unlimited?
What it means to me to be unlimited is to feel that every resource I have is unlimited. So to me, it's greatly dependent on how I feel about my current resources. So whether it be, did I get enough sleep? Can I sleep more? No, I don't need to. It's unlimited. I feel energetically unbound. Can I eat more? No, I'm satiated. That's great. And it's all these many things that I think add up to this feeling of unlimitedness. I almost want to say there's an ease to thinking about the future, or there's an ease to thinking about what I can accomplish. If I'm not feeling unlimited, I feel limited, right? And with that, I feel that my dreams need to be also limited. So to feel unlimited, to feel limitless, it would probably come from a foundation of being satiated in every type of way, where having more of that thing is not necessary. And it's, I think, going to that stasis level And that to me is what would unlock a feeling of unlimited.
Mm-hmm. And second question, when you want to access that unlimited feeling, what song do you listen to?
I think it's probably going to be Find Me by Sigma and Birdie.
Awesome. Well, I will have that added to the Unlimited Podcast playlist.
Yay.
So everybody can check that out. Thank you so much, Babs, for being here and having this conversation and sharing what you do. I'm really excited about this as a way to think forward.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. I so appreciate you being here. If you got something out of today's episode, please share it. Leave me a review, take a screenshot, and post it on social with a shout out to me. Send it to a friend or, all of the above. Want to hang out more? Join me on Instagram. Or better yet, get on my mailing list to make sure you don't miss out on anything. And remember, your possibilities are as unlimited as you are. Allow yourself to shine, my friend. The world needs your light. See you next time.